Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are honored to be with Andreina Seijas, Senior Consultant at Iden City in Barcelona, Catalonia, Spain.
Hi, how you doing? It's great to talk to you finally after all this time we've been trying to get together.
Hi, Jim. Everything's great. I'm happy to see you after a long time. I'm here in Barcelona now. The summer is getting started, so very happy to be here right now.
Okay, great. You know, we've had a lot of opportunities to talk with each other, and I admire the work that you do. But what was it that first inspired you? You know, how did you get to that inspiration moment to say, I'm going to dedicate myself to working on the nighttime economy? And when did you first hear that term or that concept?
So that brings me back to when I used to live in Venezuela, in my home country. I was born there and I grew up in Caracas, the capital. And as you might know, Caracas was for many years one of the most dangerous and violent cities around the world. And growing up as a young woman in this city, I always had the curiosity of what could we do to change the situation. That we had a self-imposed curfew. We couldn't go out at night because of how dangerous it was. And most of the nighttime activity that I could access, growing up as a young woman, was either private parties or events in shopping malls, private spaces. So I saw that I had the opportunity to travel to certain places, and I saw how in other cities they appropriated space, public space, in very positive and diverse ways, and that wasn't happening in my hometown. So I got curious, and with a good friend who's a sociologist, also Venezuelan, he and I started doing this exploratory walks and observations of different parts of Caracas at night. We sat down with notebooks and we wrote down. So at 6:30, people are moving from their offices to the metro. Then at 7, they're moving into cafes. At 8, so we started taking notes of what was happening, pedestrian flows and different activities. And then we had an opportunity to write a paper. And we were, we saw a call for papers. And we thought, okay, there must be some theoretical background to all this. And we Googled and we found there was a field that some people like Will Straw like to call night studies. And we thought, oh, wow, there's more people worried about the night. And most of the studies that we could find, and this was 2008. This was 12 years ago, more than 12 years ago. And we saw most studies came from the UK, they came from Australia, they came from France or the Netherlands, but nothing from Latin America. And we started writing what we saw, what we observed, and we realized that there needed to be more work, more research around the topic. And that's the first time I read nighttime economy, and I thought, what is this? What does it mean? And I was looking at the field from a social perspective at first. So I decided to look at how the absence of night spaces for young people could have negative repercussions over social capital, over trust, because the night is, of course, a quintessential space for meeting others, particularly for young men and women. They go out at night, they form identities, they meet friends, and how in the absence of this, what's the impact over society? And that was the topic of my master's dissertation later on in London. And that's how the story started.
Now, I know you were involved in DC working for some banking group or something like that, right?
After studying abroad, I had the opportunity to move to Washington to work for the Inter-American Development Bank, which basically is like the World Bank for Latin America. So it supports and it provides not only funding for projects, infrastructure projects, but also technical advice to cities and governments around Latin America. And from this role, I had the opportunity to travel to many places in the region. And that also was a great experience for me to observe how the night was being addressed and experienced in different cities in Latin America. And that's when I thought, wow, there's a huge space of opportunity here. Nobody, as I said before, most studies and most cases and references came from Europe. And I thought, well, there needs to be more attention paid to the night in Latin America, because in Latin America, in many of our cities, what happens is that the night is seen as a very restrictive space that needs to be, we have to reduce the hours so we can control what happens at night, so we can reduce crime, so we can handle antisocial behavior. And I thought this is not necessarily the right path. You know, I've followed for many years, and I'm a big admirer of North American urbanist Jane Jacobs' work, and she used to talk about the eyes on the street and how citizens can appropriate spaces and transform spaces, and that how a street that's packed with people feels and is perceived immediately as safer as an empty street. So I had this in mind, and that inspired me to start writing, to start gathering information about different case studies from Latin American cities, as well as to try to contribute from my own experience to this emerging field.
So, on a side note, Alicia, who works with me, has a 4-year-old, and so he's in pre-K, and a lot of pre-K is all about helping a person his age learn how to, not run around naked in the classroom or, kick people or punch people. It's just like a training to become, a little bit more civil. In my opinion, nightlife, particularly the after midnight, is almost like a pre-K for young adults, where they're experimenting with relationships and sexuality and learning how to drink responsibly, or learning what they like and how to really, build relationships with other people that are respectful and that are, oriented to an adult lifestyle. So I don't know what you think about that, but I see that as a value of those extended hours. And obviously it's an experimentation period of life, and people make mistakes and they do stupid things, and then they learn from their consequences. But I think the role of government and the role of society is to allow these spaces to evolve. It's where a lot of creative people emerge, where they have that opportunity for exploration. But at the same time, there needs to be some monitoring of it. And so that, I think, it leads to my next question. You decided to go to Harvard, of all places, to study this, and then to do your PhD on this field of governance in the night.
Yeah, so after doing all these explorations, traveling around Latin America, also engaging with people in Europe and in the US, and learning how there was, growing momentum around the topic, I thought, well, I need to dedicate myself a few years just to think about this field and what's going on in the world. Because at the time, we saw in the news often how new cities were appointing new night mayors or nighttime commissions or nighttime economy managers. And I thought, okay, this is growing, but what's behind it, and where is this going, right? What's the future of this movement? And so I dedicated myself. I did my PhD in urban governance, and I decided to focus and to specialize in nighttime governance and planning. And when I talk about governance, I think it's a very important concept here. You mentioned how governments have to enable these things to happen. But one important fact is that we've learned through the years is how not only governments, but also other large group of actors, a diverse group of actors, community actors, resident groups, private sector, foundations are getting involved in contributing to understanding how cities at night could be managed in a more efficient way. And that's why we talked about governance, to refer to this large constellation of actors that are getting involved in this. And that's what I dedicated myself to study. And while I was there at Harvard, I had the opportunity to conduct a qualitative study that I did along with Mirik Milan, the former night mayor of Amsterdam, where we basically used surveys and we used interviews to then get a sense of what the dimensions of this growing night mayor movement, where some data also on it, like demographics. Most of them we found were men. Most of them had very limited budgets to operate. We also were able to identify a typology of night mayors and nighttime advocacy organizations, some of them placed inside of city government, while others placed outside as independent organizations. And this helped, to some extent, push the field a little bit forward as we were gathering new knowledge on what this is all about. And also, we were able to then, I was able through my research to also gather information on different case studies. I specialized in as I said, in governance. And by this, I mean understanding what are the different elements that need to be in place in cities for them to have a nighttime strategy. And I talk about strategy because I think one of the biggest challenges we've seen over the past many years is that from the perspective of urban planning in particular, is that the night has been a blind spot. Planners have ignored the night for a long time. We've seen, if we look at traditional zoning, nighttime and entertainment activities have been separated completely from business uses and residential uses. And now, as we look at cities that are becoming more compact, cities that are becoming what we have, the UN and also, with a climate change agenda in mind, we're now trying to promote cities that are walkable, cities that are more integrated, that are more inclusive. So we cannot separate nightlife anymore from other uses. And the question is, how can we bring all this together in a way that works for everyone, not only for those who want to go out, but also for those who want to rest. And that got me into understanding how most nighttime policies, I like to talk about two main types of nighttime policies. Those are reactive and that promote that restricting nighttime activity is the way to better manage the externalities that have to do with life at night, so noise or violence, and then they have the enabling policies, which are those that promote extending or having more flexible hours at night to then incorporate other types of activities that not necessarily have to do with alcohol or involve alcohol consumption, but also other types of activities, of leisure activities at night. So I was able to then get a better sense through my studies of where this nighttime governance field is moving to, and also what kinds of policies exist, as well as now from an advisory role, I collaborate with cities, helping them think about in strategic terms, think about how to build these steps to have to have a vision and to have a plan to better handle their nighttime economies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you inspired me with the term governance, and we also look at kind of that nexus point, almost like a force field analysis. You've got the market forces that drive certain activity or behavior in cities, and you mentioned some of them. The concentration of mixed-use development and residential and office and nightlife being more integrated with each other, changes in mobility and how people move in cities, and the pressure to remove cars from the mix other than the transport services. And then you also have the demographic shifts, but over and above that, you have the limited resources for government, changes in policing with people not necessarily oriented to becoming police officers. And, like you said, the reactionary responses with gun violence, particularly in the US, where that initial response is to close earlier and to put more police out without look at some of the underlying factors. And governance for me is really not just the government, but also organized hospitality alliances for businesses, public safety teams where the different agencies work together. And like you said, a more dedicated focal point within the city to help manage all of this. Now, are there other people that you know of that have made this decision? I mean, clearly the whole night mayor concept has caught on. And in some cases, it seems like cities just say, oh, well, that's what we need. And they hire somebody and they put them in that job. And then they have limited resources or actually a limited strategy plan. But what you're doing, and I guess others in the field are doing, is to try to document what it takes beyond just hiring a person. But have you seen other people say, well, I want to really study this a little bit more? Are you in touch with other people who are doing graduate work?
Yeah, so it's been fascinating to see over the past several years how I often get emails from former students from Harvard, or because I as part of my PhD, I had the opportunity to co-teach a couple of classes, and as a matter of fact, a few days ago, a former student reached out to me saying that he became interested in the topic and he's now He's now interested in being specializing in nighttime planning and governance as well. I get emails a lot from people in Latin America, from Peru, from Argentina, from Colombia, also from all over Europe. More and more young minds are getting interested in how to manage cities at night from different perspectives. And because I think one of the beauties, but also one of the challenges of this field is how transversal it is, how multifaceted it is. So you could address it from an urban planning perspective, but also from a data science perspective. We need tons of data for this to push the field forward. That's one of the things that has been a challenge, as many cities until very recently didn't aggregate their data, in terms of day and night, or we didn't pay attention to the data we had to inform how things develop at night. But yeah, definitely there's been growing interest. And speaking of it, I think to what you were saying before, definitely the term governance encompasses many interests, and that's one of the challenging aspects of managing cities at night, being able to recognize that a city, just during the same as during the day, but at night, some elements are more sensitive. We're more sensitive to noise. We're more sensitive to certain flows, and how there's situations in which existing regulations or existing infrastructure, or the lack of certain infrastructure like transportation at night, for instance, can then lead to increasing inequalities, increasing or excluding certain groups like nighttime workers that require certain services to operate at night for them just to perform their jobs. But it's something that I had recently the opportunity to work here in Barcelona with the city. And it connects well with what you were saying before, how young people have these experiences at night. And I think the pandemic was a very important point to remind us of how important the night is. And the reason why I'm saying this is because for a very long time, nightlife was closed. Also after the pandemic, or as things started to reopen, we realized that many activities that were open at night started to disappear. But the need for young people to go out will never disappear. It will never go away. People will need to go out and meet, and the need to socialize is always there. So in Barcelona in particular, we've been seeing how in the absence of nightlife, or in the absence of enough activities for people to go out at night, there has been a recent phenomenon, which is people partying in the street, taking the party to the streets, gathering in public spaces, drinking in public spaces, or gathering at the beach, which has created many troubles for the city that has to, the next morning clean everything up, or the noise that is created when people are transiting from public spaces, or even if they're having a party in a public plaza that is surrounded by residential buildings. So one of the things we did here to try to look at the situation and understand what the problems were was to organize workshops with 4 different interest groups. So on one hand, we had the different authorities within City Hall, so people from prevention teams, the police, the different representatives of services in the city. That was one interest group. The second interest group was representatives from nightlife associations, as well as owners of clubs and bars and restaurants, representatives of the tourism industry in the city. A third group was residents, and a fourth group was young people, like representatives of youth groups, student groups, to understand how these 4 very different interest groups, they have different concerns, different needs, but in the end, they all came together. And based on the elements they have in common, we're building a vision for the city. And it's interesting to see how one of the changes that has emerged from the pandemic is how we have learned that concentrating nighttime activity in one area no longer works. The impacts of that are too huge, too big. And now we're talking about proximity, the concept of proximity, and the concept of proximity applied to many things. I was just in Poland this week for the World Urban Forum, and we were talking a lot about the 15-minute city and this idea of proximity, of having different services and different activities within a 15-minute radius. And that includes nighttime activity as well. The question is, how can we make all these activities coexist in a way that, represents and includes all these interests? So that's when the governance aspect enters. We need to have permanent institutions, instances, roles, they vary. They don't have to have the same formula in every city, but the important thing is that each city has at least a space where these interests can be represented, where there's a space for dialogue, and also where there's a space for to look at regulations and to update certain regulations that are no longer serving the city in the best way. So I think we've learned a lot in the past couple of years with the pandemic, seeing a halt or a pause in many of our nighttime activities in urban areas, and now it's an opportunity to rethink them, to restructure them, and to think proactively on how to make them better.
Since I have you, I'm going to ask you one more question that I've been playing around with from an urban planning point of view. And I got this idea from Bobby Boone, who I just recently interviewed. And he had suggested, now that you have so many downtowns that invested, or cities that invested in the high-rise office complexes and the high-rise residential and created that density like you were talking about. But now they're challenged. There was just an article recently in The Atlantic that talked about the small percentage of workers who are going back to the offices. And that really drives a lot of the local social activity, whether it be the cafes or the restaurants, and then people who stay for happy hours and socializing into the night. But he had suggested that property owners and perhaps even city planning departments through zoning, if you want to have this type of development, that the street level retail, which was very much encouraged, but now you can't get shoe stores and clothing stores and others to open up, that they should start thinking about these storefronts as amenities and supporting the cafe restaurant industry, not as a profit center, but rather as an amenity, bring people back to the office or want to live in the city, or adding other uses like daycare centers, particularly for night workers, or creating public restroom facilities, that people can use, so that you adapt the storefront to be more in tune with people's needs, whether it be, some kind of a fitness center or some kind of a doggy daycare center, uses that are not necessarily retail, but for the property owner, they could get more residents, or the office building property owner, they could get more companies, and workers would be more willing to come back to work. What do you think of that idea of really a public policy that shifts the focus away from just the requirement of a street level retail with an anticipation of stores to a requirement that there be amenities added to the development?
Definitely, I think, this is something that we knew before the pandemic, that retail was undergoing many changes. Of course, we cannot think of retail as we used to before, and the pandemic definitely accelerated this process, and we're seeing many stores moving now online. So definitely, I think it's really important to think about public policies that encourage the use of main commercial areas, main commercial arteries, the main streets, the high streets, for amenities and for social use rather than retail. As well as you also, as I was listening to you, made me think about shopping malls and how we should repurpose and think about the shopping malls, because now we do shopping in other ways. So those structures are already there. How can we repurpose shopping malls in a way that they can serve different social functions, like the ones you said, care, or well-being, fitness, aside from retail. But definitely, when it comes to urban areas, one thing that is very important is to take into account the possibilities that time offers. So when I talk to planners, I always mention that it's important, like space is a very important variable for urban planning. We always talk in terms of space and what space means, but we forget about time. And thinking about, these policies should also have a temporal component. So how can we use these spaces in a more efficient and productive way throughout the 24-hour cycle? And that not only applies to these main streets and these like former existing retail options, but also many cities have wonderful, services such as gyms or libraries or civic centers or cultural venues that could be used throughout the day for different purposes. So you can then have a broader supply of activities at night that are public, that are not only private, but also that, cater to a broad group of people. And so yeah, I think there's definitely many possibilities in this sense. And it's key to work for these things to work. It's key to, on one hand, incorporate these topics finally on cities' agendas, which has been one of the main challenges. As I said, I recently came back from the World Urban Forum, which is the biggest conference for urbanists around the world that happens every 2 years. And this year was the first time ever that there was a session dedicated to the night. It's like it's been absent. It's been completely ignored by planners for many years. So now that we have the attention of the global community and planners internationally, about the night, I think it's a great opportunity to start thinking in ways to make it happen. To make it happen by looking into our zoning codes, to make it happen by looking into our regulations that have to do with time, not only licensing, but also other regulations in which, like how public spaces that are open at night, looking also in terms like noise regulations, and also to look at these issues from a sustainability perspective. What's the impact of nighttime activity from a sustainability standpoint, and how can we make this activity also beneficial from this point of view?
Well, we could talk forever about this. I think we share a lot of common strategies and ideas, and I appreciate you taking the time to share what you have done, and you certainly are making a significant impact on an emerging field. And it's really been an honor to meet with you and have you participate in this interview. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you so much, Jim. Likewise, and we'll be in touch.